Welcome to this Gary Clarke Tech course, which is going to be all about test-driven development using the Pest PHP framework. Here we're going to build a simple API using test-driven development to help us figure out the functionality and to write clean code which works. Okay, so let's have a quick look at what we're going to build. It's going to be a very simple API, and so as you can see here, I'm hitting a books endpoint. I have like a book ID, and I'm just going to get back some information regarding that book. If we look at the JSON in more detail, you'll see that here we have the information for a book, but also we have this nested property here, which is going to be all about the author details. Now, I know this looks simple, but in reality this is going to be actually quite a complex piece of work because there's lots of things which we need to think about, because even though Pest is maybe associated with the Laravel community, we're not actually going to be using a framework. We're going to write all of this stuff from scratch, and so all those nice little helpers, these test helpers which you get from frameworks like Laravel and Symfony, which sort of mimic pinging requests to APIs and things like that, we're going to have to create all that stuff ourselves. Things like refreshing the database for your tests so that your database is starting in the same condition as it was for the previous test. We're going to have to come up with all that functionality ourselves as well, but we're going to drive it all out using tests. And when I say that we're starting from scratch, we really are starting from scratch. We're going to have 0 lines of code. The first thing we're going to do is install Pest PHP, and then we're going to think about what do we need to prove in order to know that we have a working application. And so we'll start with a feature test, which does that end-to-end, send a request, get a response back, and then we're going to branch off that and create all the different components as we go. So we'll have a feature test which runs as the backbone for our application, and then we'll have lots of little unit tests which will go and do things like create routing, create requests, responses, things like migrating the database, all those kinds of things which we take for granted when we use things like Laravel and Symfony. We're not going to take them for granted here because we're going to actually create all of those ourselves. It's going to be a lot of fun. The very first thing that we're going to need to do is install Pest. So I've come to the documentation here because it's really good, and there's an installation page, and we can just copy a couple of steps from here. So this first one here, compose or require Pest PHP /pest. Let's just grab that into our clipboard, go over to my terminal. I've got an open project here, it's brand new, there is literally nothing in here. We're about to add the first files now. So I'll paste that in there, compose or require Pest PHP. Notice I'm requiring this as a dev dependency because it's a testing framework, it's used for testing only, we don't need to push this to production. And so let's just hit enter on that. And it's asking me this question here about allow plugins. You might have seen this when you've installed things with Composer. I'm just going to say yes. So I'll hit Y and press enter, and then that should install Pest PHP. Let's go and see what we actually have in our project now. So we have a Composer JSON. We've got Pest PHP as a dev requirement. We've got this config part here where it's telling us to allow Pest PHP plugins, and then we have a vendor folder, and inside of there we've got Pest PHP and all of its dependencies. As you can see, quite a lot of dependencies. Let me draw your attention to this one. There's one dependency which is important that I draw your attention to, and that is this one here, PHP unit, because Pest is built on top of PHP unit. It can't exist without PHP unit, and so that's quite interesting because it means that everything that we can do in PHP unit we can also do in Pest. Okay, back in the Pest documentation, we have one other thing which we need to do here, and that is to initialize Pest. And so if we grab this one here where it's saying vendor bin pest init, and then again in our terminal paste that in there, you'll see that it might ask you this question here: do you want to show Pest some love by starting it on GitHub? And as you can see, I've said yes, and I've gone and done that behind the scenes also. And now that we've initialized Pest, you'll notice that we have this tests folder, and inside of there we have a folder for feature tests with an example feature test, and there's also a folder for unit tests, and that also contains a unit test example test. And then we have this file here, Pest. We're going to come and have a look at this in more detail later on, but this is basically where you can do all kinds of custom configuration and things like that. And here what they're doing is creating a custom expectation. We're going to do those also, so we don't need to get into this just yet. The other thing that you see here is just a test case file. So if you think of PHP unit, if you're familiar with PHP unit, they've basically created an empty test case which extends PHP unit test case. And so this is where you can sort of do your own kind of custom stuff and create your own little test helpers and things. I think what we're going to do here is, because we're going to be creating like an API, I'm just going to give this a more sort of specific name to our needs. So I'm just refactoring this and changing the name of the test case class inside of the test folder to API test case. We don't need to think any more about this for now, but we will be using it in the future. What I would like to do now though is just run the tests, and so I can do that with this command here. So vendor bin pest. So just like where you might do vendor bin PHP unit, you do the same thing with pest, and it will run those example tests. Let's see what happens when I hit enter. Okay, and so this is what it looks like when it runs the tests. So as you can see, we have a pass in our tests feature example test and also in our tests unit example test. So each one of those files contained a simple test, and as you can see, we're just asserting that true is true in the feature test and doing the exact same thing in the unit test. So we're going to throw these away eventually, but it's good to have them there just to know that we've got everything up and running. And so hopefully yours should be working exactly the same as mine if you've followed me up to this point. One other thing that I've noticed here says your XML configuration validates against a deprecated schema. Migrate your XML configuration using migrate configuration. So what that is talking about is the php unit.xml file here, and this is used to sort of configure your tests and decide where your test suite lives. But what it's telling me is that this schema is deprecated, and it's telling me how to update it or migrate it. So let's do that again. So basically we run that same command, except this time we add on this, what it's telling me to add here, which is a little flag, migrate configuration. Okay, and now it's telling me it's migrated the configuration. So when I go and look at that file now, as you can see, it's changed slightly, but it's still doing the same thing. I prefer mine to have 4 spaces, so I'm going to indent it with 4 spaces. Okay, so we're all up to date. We've installed pest, we've initialized pest, we've run our first tests, and we've made sure that our configuration PHP unit XML file is all up to date. And we also renamed just a default test case class which it puts in the test folder. We've renamed ours to API test case, and that is going to be used for the more sort of API kind of feature test kind of things. Okay, it is now time to write our first test, and the goal here is to have a test which tests end to end. We send a request into the application, it sends a response back, and we want to check that that response contains the correct information and that it has the correct headers and status codes, things like that. And so this is going to be a feature test because it's an end-to-end test. We're not testing an individual unit, we're testing a whole piece of functionality. So we're going to put that in our feature folder. Let's just go and remind ourselves. So inside of tests, we have this feature folder here. But if you can also remember what we said at the end of the last one, we created this API test case here, which we said is going to be used more for our sort of feature test kind of things. Well, we want to be able to use that, and the way that pest works is that it is built on top of PHP units, and so the tests that we write in our feature tests, we want them to actually sort of sit on top of this API test case, which if you remember just extends test case from PHP unit. And so if we go back to the pest.php file, this is where you sort of configure these kind of things. If you want to use a specific test case in your tests, then you can set that up here. And so if you uncomment this line at the top of this file here, you should have this line. If you don't, just copy mine. But here, basically, what we're saying is use this as our sort of base test case in all of the tests which are inside of the feature folder. So that feature folder that we just looked at there, this is where we're going to write our feature tests, and the tests that we write are going to be written based on what is this PHP unit API test case which we created here. Okay, so far so good. Now what we need to do is actually go and create a feature test. Let's have a look at the one which already exists in this folder here, and you'll notice if you've used PHP unit that the syntax is a little bit different here. So what we have is this function called test, which is passed a string as the first argument, so that is the name of this test, and you typically use this to say what this test does. And then we have this callback function, and it's inside of here where we actually write our test. And so this syntax here, what this is saying is we're expecting the Boolean true to be true. So both of these things are specific to pest. So this is an expectation. We'll get into it more shortly. And so what you do is you say expect, and then you pass it the value, and then you say what you expect that value to be, or what kind of condition. In this case, we're saying we expect it to be true. But there's lots of other things. So if I just use my auto completion here in PHP Storm, you can say I have all of these: to match array, to match, to be an instance of a particular class, to be this, to be in when you want to check if it's in a string or it's in an array. So we'll have a look at some of these more as we use them, but I just want to show you how this actually works for the time being. And something else which I should show you, and probably which is what is giving me that auto completion there, is I have a plugin for PHP Storm called Pest. So I think this is like an official pest plugin for PHP Storm. It's completely free, so I just installed this, and then once I restarted again, then I was able to get all of that auto completion, and it makes other suggestions and things like that. So if you're using PHP Storm, highly recommend this. Don't know if there's a similar thing for VS Code, but if you're using that, it's definitely worth checking it out and seeing if that does exist. Okay, so I think you get the gist of how this works, and obviously we're going to learn more as we go along. So it's good enough to go and write our first test. So I don't want this to be just a load of theory. I want this to be a practical course, you know, so as we're actually doing stuff, I'll explain the stuff to you as we do it. So we're creating a PHP file. So that's the big difference here. We're not creating a PHP class like you would do with PHP unit. We just create a PHP file, and I'm going to call this books API test. An important thing to notice about that is it must be suffixed with the word test. So books API and then test.php, and that is what will help Pest know that this is a test file. Okay, so let's go and write this test. If we looked at that last one, it was just said test example. So we want a bit of a more descriptive string, and as well as using this test function, you can make it a little bit more readable by using a function called it, which will do the same thing. So you say it followed by what you expect the outcome to be, which in our case is we want it to retrieve the correct data from the books API. So let's go ahead and use that. Notice how we can leave spaces in between this. This is just a normal string telling you what this test does, and you can name them whatever you want, or as we see here, it's not called name, it's called description. So you can give it whatever description you want. Describe what you're expecting your test to do, and then we just need our closure. So we're going to say function, and I'm not passing any arguments for now, but we can do that, and we probably will do that later on. So now we're inside of our test, and we need to decide what we're going to do here and how we're going to achieve it. So I'm going to break this down into 3 different stages. Now, I've called this many different things over the years, but here I'm going to go back to arrange, act, and assert. So the first step is you set up any fixtures, things like that, which you're going to need for your test. The second step will be the actual thing which should happen in order to trigger this, and then we're going to make some assertions. So arrange, act, assert. At the moment, the data, we're not going to set that up for the time being, because that is going to mean creating some data and dealing with databases and things like that. What I want to do for the time being is just concentrate on what do we want to do, what do we expect to see when we do that, and then the setup, we'll come back to that later on, I think. So For the act part, what we want to do is make a request to our application. How we're going to do that inside of a test. If you think about Laravel, if you think about Symfony, they have test helpers which sort of mimic making requests. And so that's what we're going to do here. The way I'm going to do this is I should be able to call on this, and that means I can access my underlying PHP unit methods or any methods which I write in my test case classes. So this is something which I'm likely to write in here. I'm going to create a little test helper inside of this file, and I'll be able to access that inside of my book's API test. And so I'm going to call this simply JSON. And so what we're saying here is we're making a request and we're expecting to get JSON back. Or you could use this to also post JSON to our application, but we're not doing that here. What we're doing is we're going to make a GET request. So let's actually be quite specific about what these properties are going to be called. So the first one will be the actual method, and the second property will be the URI. So the URI that we're looking at here is just going to be books1. And so we're hard coding it for now, but we might make that dynamic a little bit later. But for the time being, this is the method that we're going to use to mimic making that request to our application or to our API. And from that, what we want to do is get back a response or some kind of response object which we can sort of interrogate and make sure that we're getting the correct information. Does it contain the correct body? Is the correct status code there? Does it have the right headers? And so one thing you'll note there is that none of this stuff actually exists yet. We don't have response objects. We don't even have this test helper method. This is truly test driven. We're writing the test first, and then that is going to sort of dictate the parts that we need to go and follow up with. Okay, let's start on this assertion. So if you remember the previous feature test, the way that the assertions looked is we had this function called expect. You pass that a particular value, and then you create an expectation. So we shall say expect response, and you can chain this stuff. So what I'm going to say is expect response get status. So I want to check that I'm getting a 200 OK status. And here I want it to be an integer. So we'll say to be int. So I figured a lot of these out just by seeing what autocomplete has. So this one is going to make sure that the response status is an integer. And like I say, you can chain these things. And I can also say to be. And so for that, then you pass the value. So I'm expecting the status to be an integer with a value of 200. Okay, so we have a couple of expectations there about the status, but we can then chain on other expectations. So by using this AND function, I can say response, and then I can say get body. And here I really want some functionality which I don't think Pest has. It has similar kind of things to what I want to do. But basically what I want to do is check that one JSON string matches another JSON string. Now dealing with strings and writing strings, JSON strings, it can be quite fiddly, and there's a lot of scope for human error, or a lot of opportunity for human error. So what we're going to do, the way we're going to do this is I'm going to create a special helper function, and we'll pass that an array, and then it will actually take that array, convert it to JSON, and then check it against the JSON, so the body in our case, which we are examining. So how do I want this to look? I'm just going to call it to match JSON, and then this will actually take an array. You'll notice a squiggly line because that expectation doesn't actually exist in Pest yet, and it's really easy to create your own custom expectation. So this is going to be a little nice exercise which will show us how to do that also. So this is an array version of the JSON which we're expecting to match, and if you remember when we looked at it in the browser, we had a book, but also one of the properties on that book was an author, which will in turn have its own properties. So we're looking at some kind of nesting there, which we'll figure out later when we come to work on our models. Okay, so I've now sketched out our test. The first thing I'm going to do here is I'm just going to run this and then take things from there. I'm not going to try and think too far ahead myself. So fendo bin pest, and I just want to run the tests in my feature folder. So I'm just going to say tests feature. Okay, and the first error I'm getting here is it's saying the class tests API test case was not found. If you remember back in our pest.php, we said that that is the test case class that we want to use for our feature tests. So what's going wrong here? Let's go and have a look at the API test case. As you can see, this has a namespace, but we haven't actually configured any auto-loading for our tests folder. So let's go to composer.json. I'm just going to drop it in here just above the config entry, and I'm going to do one for autoload, and I'm going to do one for autoload dev. Okay, so autoload, we're using PSR4, and we are mapping the app namespace to a folder called source. The reason we're getting a squiggly line is because that doesn't exist yet. So we'll let PHP Storm create that for us. As you can see, we now have that src folder. And then for autoload dev, I want to map the tests namespace to the tests folder. Okay, so once you create those entries, there's one important step. You need to actually tell Composer about those changes, and you do that by saying composer dump autoload. So composer dump autoload. Okay, so it tells me it's generated the autoload files, and so when I run the test now, I'm expecting to see a different message. Okay, so it's actually run the tests. We have one failed and one passed. And so the passing test is our example test. We don't actually need that anymore. Let's go and delete it. So example test, we'll get rid of that. And so we should only have one test in our feature test now. Let's run this again. Okay, so we've run one test that fails. It says call to undefined method test feature books API test JSON. And so like I say, that test helper method for making those requests to our API doesn't actually exist yet. And so that's something which we need to create in order to move on. So we'll start on that in the next one. Okay, so here we are. We've created our first test, which is a feature test, books API test. We've put a couple of lines in there. One of them is to sort of mimic making a request to our API, and the other one is something called an expectation. So we've got a couple of expectations there. We're checking that we should be getting a value of 200 for the status, an integer 200, and that the body, the JSON, will match this. And so we've done it in array format because that's nice and easy for us to read, and it means we're less likely to make mistakes. So when we ran the tests, this is what we got. We got a message saying that the method, call to undefined method, books API test JSON. So we need to go and create this test helper. A good thing about Pest is it makes it really easy for you to create test helpers for use in your tests. So let's go over to the file that we want to do that in, and that will be in API test case. So here we want a public function, and this will be JSON. We already know a couple of the parameters here. So the first one is going to be method. I think we'll just default that to get. That sounds quite sensible. The next one will be URI, and so for that, default to a root. And then let's think about what else we might want here. Even though we've only said we're going to use two of those properties here as arguments, there will be other things which you might need to make this reusable. For example, what if we weren't doing a GET request? What if we were doing a POST request? We'd need to be able to post some kind of data. So it'd be good to have that as an argument also. So for the third one, we shall say data, and we'll make that in array form. And then to finish this off, we'll also say headers in case we want to set some headers. And again, that will be an array, and we'll just default that to an empty array. Okay, and if we go back and have a look at how we are using this, we're calling a couple of methods off of the returned object from this JSON method. So we're expecting some kind of response object with methods called getStatus and one called getBody, and these are the values that we're also expecting from that. So what we're just going to do here for the time being, because we don't have a response class or anything like that, we're just going to fake it to get our way past this point and onto the next part, and then we can go back and start putting in the real implementation. And that's one of the main things which you will do with test-driven development. You'll quickly get a passing test, and then you can go back and refactor for clean code, or refactor, remove duplication, and put in the real implementation, just step by step, running the tests all the time. So let's go and do that. So back in our API test case, here we're going to say eventually we're going to return a response, an instance of a response class, but we don't have that right now. So let's just make this an object for the time being, and then here we shall say return new, and we'll use an anonymous class. We need a method called getStatus, which will return an integer. And here we're just going to fake it, like I said, we're just going to return 200. And then we want one called getBody, I think we called it, response getBody. This is going to return a string. And so here we need to return the JSON in order for this to pass. So basically what I've done there is just hard coded it in. And then hopefully when we go and run this now, we should get past that stage. Let's see if that is true. Okay, so we have one failure. Okay, we have a different message. We have a different error message now. It's saying call to a member function to match JSON on string. So I think what that means is that we've actually got past this point. I think it also means that we've got past this point. So it's confirming that we are getting a status, which is an integer and which is 200. Let's just confirm that. So I'm just going to put a semicolon on the end of that line and then just comment this stuff out and run it, and hopefully I should see a passing test. Okay, and we do indeed see a passing test, so we know that this first expectation is being confirmed, and then we can move on to the next one. And so we need to think about that error message that we got there. Let's just go and remind ourselves. So the error message is call to a member function to match JSON on a string, and so this is an expectation which doesn't yet exist. And the good thing about Pest is it makes it really easy for you to come up with your own custom expectations, and that's what we'll do in the next one. But just before we go and do that, let's actually return to our API test case and put our type hints in here, otherwise people will get annoyed at me. So the method will be a string. Let's start dropping these onto their own lines, because this line's going to get pretty long. The URI will also be a string. Data will be an array, and headers will also be an array. I think I'm supposed to drop this bit onto its own line, but what we've done there, the main thing is we've added type hints for our parameters for our JSON test helper. Okay, we now want to go and create our own custom test expectation. The place that we do this is in that pest file. If you remember the pest file, we used it to say that we want to use the API test case in the features folder, in any tests in the features folder. So we do it in that same file here. The good thing about this file is it's got some examples already done for you. So we have this one here for expectations, and it tells you all about expectations. And then there's a little example here which we can sort of copy and create something for our own needs. So basically what you're doing is you are extending the expectations. So you say expect, and then you extend that using this extend function. The first argument is a string. That will be the name of your method, of your test function. So in our case, that will be to match JSON. And then again, you just create this closure, and in there you put the logic of how this should behave. So what the actual expectation is. So in this one, it's very simple. It's just a simple demonstration. They're just saying expect the return value to be 1. So let's just start by copying this, and we'll customize it to our needs. So that means we don't need that old one. This will be to match JSON, and if you remember, we're actually passing an array to this. So that is what we can pass to the closure. So here we'll say array expected, and then we can actually access the value which we are matching against, which will be our JSON. So we can say this value. So in our case, what that means at the moment is this JSON here equals, and we're going to JSON decode this. So again, we're saying this value, and we'll say true to make that an associative array. And then we can simply say return this, and then we have access to these expectations, and we have one here to match array. And so by passing expected into that, then we can say this value. So in our case, that will be response get body will match the expected array. So we've converted that to an array, so it's easier for us to make that comparison. Okay, so let's go and run our tests and see what it tells us. And we actually get a pass. Advice to you is always be suspicious when things pass first time. So let's go and see what we can change here. Inside of our API test case where we are hard coding this and returning it, let's actually change the ID of the book to 2. And hopefully that should mean that we now get a fail. Okay, perfect. So now we get a fail, and it's saying failed, asserting that 2 matches the expected one. So it's failing for the reasons that we expect it to fail, and this is good. So what we now have is a passing test. However, it's all faked, isn't it? Because this is a hard-coded return status, and this is a hard-coded return body. And another thing is this isn't actually a real response, it's just an anonymous class. So we're going to need to think about creating a real response class at some point. Okay, so back in our API test case, originally what we did is we just put in this temporary measure just to get our test passing and just to sort of start heading in the right direction of where we want to go with this. But now we need something a little bit more permanent. We want this to actually return a response and not just an anonymous class. And so that's what we're going to start here. So let's have a think about how this would look. What I'm going to do is rely on knowledge which is already in my head. So sometimes with test-driven development, you're just feeling your way out writing tests. Sometimes you already have an idea of how something should work. And certainly with response classes, that's something which I know a little bit about. So what I'm going to do for the time being is just underneath where we are returning this new class, instead I'm going to return a new response. Obviously this response class does not exist yet, so just like we've done with other stuff, we're sort of writing the code we wish we had rather than code which already exists. And this will take 3 arguments. The first one will be the body, so I'm just going to be explicit and use named arguments here. So body, and what will that be? That will actually be this body content here. So let's actually go and create some body as well. So body equals, and basically we can just take this from here, copy it. I'm going to delete all of that in a second, but I'm just still using it for reference. So body equals that. And then the next parameter will be a status code. So I'm going to set that to 200. And then the third one will be headers, and we'll just have an empty array for the time being. Okay, so that means I can come up here and delete our anonymous class completely, and here where we are saying return an object, now we are going to return a response. And so I'm fully expecting this to now break my tests. Let's see what happens. Okay, so we have a failed test. This is an error, not an expectation failure. This is an error, meaning there's something wrong with the code. And so it's telling us that tests response not found. And obviously it's not found because that class doesn't actually exist yet. Let's go and have a quick look at that test. Yeah, there's something which I want to change. So if you look here, we've called this status code, but here we're saying get status. So let's stay consistent, and we'll also say the method will be called get status code. Obviously that's not going to change anything about the state of our test. We're still going to have a failing test for the same reason we don't have a response. And so what we're going to do now is have a little chat about how typical PHP or modern PHP applications work, and then we'll start creating the response class and all the other bits that we need. If we run the test right now, we know what's going to happen. We're going to get this test error. So it's not a test failure, it's a test error. There is a difference. An error means that there is something wrong with your code, and the problem with our code is that we don't have this response class. So let's go and create that one. This is a test-driven development tutorial, so we're going to create that using a test. Okay, so for this we're actually going to switch over and we're going to do a unit test, because this is not a feature test like an end-to-end test or like a functionality test. We are testing a specific unit, and what we're going to do is just test that a response can be created. Okay, so inside of unit we will just call this response test. So it's a PHP file, not a PHP class. Response test. But remember, it has to be suffixed with the word test. And then we will simply say test, a response object can be created. Okay, so we've got our closure there. We don't need to pass in any information to that, any data to that. What we do want to do is, there's going to be two stages to this, I think. Act will be trying to actually create that response object, and then the assert will just do some assertions on it to ensure that it does exist, so we can maybe try and check some properties or something like that. So act assert, let's go response equals new response. Can you remember how we said that we were going to create this? Let's just go and remind ourselves. So we want a method and a URI. Okay, so response equals new response. The first thing will be the body, and here we'll just create some JSON. So we'll simply go with foo and bar. So foo, and then the second argument will be the status code. Then we need to just make some assertions to make sure that this response does exist. So what we can do is we can actually check the body and also check the status code on our response object. And we've said we're going to have methods get body and get status code. So if you want to work ahead of me, then by all means give it a go. All you need to do is do a similar thing to what we are doing in the Books API test, except you'll obviously have to do this differently. But we're checking the status code, and we're also going to check the body. So if you do want to have a go at that, just pause me now and give it a go. This should be fairly straightforward because we've done it once. Expect, and we're saying response, and we'll say get status, and we'll check that it is an integer again, to be int, and we can chain on the end of there. So if you want to check something else, we'll just say to be 200. And then if you remember what we did where you could chain these by saying and then we'll say response, and this time get body, and we now know that we have this to match JSON test expectation, and so in there we can just check that our JSON looks like this. Drop that into its own line there. Okay, let's go and run this. What we'll do is we'll run our unit tests in isolation. So tests, unit, I should see one fail and one pass. Okay, so the pass is our example test. We're not going to need that anymore, but our response test is failing because we do not have a response class. So just before we finish this one, let's delete that old example test because we don't need that anymore. Run the tests again. We have one failing unit test, and that is because we do not have a response class. And so that's what we'll do in the next one. Okay, so the state of our unit tests is we have one unit test and we're getting an error because the class response is not found. And so that's one of the great things about test-driven development. It can sometimes literally tell you what you do need to do next. And so over in source src, I'm going to create a folder called http, and then inside of there I'm going to create a class called response. Okay, and so there is a PSR for responses. This is something which I talked about in the PHP Framework Pro class, PSR 7. I'm not actually going to implement it here because it would sort of take over this entire course and it would become a PSR 7 course rather than a test-driven development course. But I'll show you the PSR now, and I've made a couple of decisions about things which will help us to be able to implement this in the future. So we'll have a look for the response interface. So if I search for response interface, that is this here. And if we look at the methods, we have a get status code, and we'll see that this extends message interface. So let's actually have a look at that. So there's a couple of things which I've actually put in here which will help us in the future. So here's our message interface, and you'll see that this actually has a method called getBody, which is also something which we have used in our code. And so we are future proofed. If we do want to implement PSR 7 in the future, everything should be okay. So we'll try and stick to methods that we see in this PSR. So for example, I could have said get content or something like that, but I knew at the back of my mind that the method for the actual content for the body is called getBody, and so we've stuck to these methods, and that means that, like I say, if we do want to use PSR 7 in the future, we can do that. Let's go back to the code, and just to finish off what I'm saying about that PSR 7, I think people have asked me about it, and if I do something about it in the future, then it'll just be a PSR 7 course on its own rather than take over what is essentially just a test-driven development course. Okay, namespace for this will be app and then HTTP. And then we need our constructor, and if we remembered how our constructor worked, we're going to say private string. This will be the body. Let's default it to an empty string, and then we will say private. This will be an integer, and this will be status code. We'll default that to 200, and there's one other, and that is private. We'll say iterable, and this will be the headers. Okay, and then I know that we're already calling on methods called getBody and getStatusCode, so I'll create getters for those. I won't create a getter for headers, and I'll explain why in a minute. So let's just go and create these. Okay, and the reason why I didn't create one of those for headers is because we're not actually calling any methods in our code for get headers. We're just calling getBody and getStatus. And something, a side effect of creating like getter methods for things and not using them is that your code coverage will actually, or your code coverage score will actually deteriorate because you're not actually testing something which you have written code for, if that makes sense. Okay, going to get rid of the squiggly lines. And now all we need to do is go back, make sure that we are using the correct response. So the one from app HTTP, and this should be get status code. Let's run the test now and see where we are with this. Okay, so we're getting a pass there. Let's run all tests. One failing test, and that is in books API test class. Tests response not found, so we should be able to get a quick win here. We just need to give this the correct namespace in the same way as what we did there. So it's actually inside of the API test case where we are creating this. So let's change this to app HTTP response. That means that we are sending back the correct response, and hopefully now if we go and run our tests, everything should be okay. Okay, 2 tests and 2 passes. The next thing I'd like to do is return to our JSON test helper, and we're going to get this to sort of behave more like the internal workings of a real PHP application, because at the moment we've just got some hard-coded body here, and then we're actually instantiating a response and returning that. But in real life, what would happen is your application would receive a request, and then using all the super globals and the information which is available to it at that time, create a request object, which would then get passed into some central mechanism in your application. We're going to use a kernel object, just like in Symfony and Laravel, and then that request will be used by the kernel in order to generate a response. So inside of there, you'd have all different things like routing and stuff like that, controllers, handlers. We'll not go as far as that in the next one, but what we are going to do is just sketch things out so we know exactly what we need to do. Let's move on. Okay, so over in our API test case, we have this JSON test helper method, which is going to help us interact with our application. But at the moment, it's not actually doing that. What it is doing is it's just hard coding some return body content and then instantiating a response. But we don't really want to do things like that. We want to do things correctly. We want to hit the internals of our application and send back the real response, which is created based on the information contained in the request. So what we're going to do here is we're not going to write any code. I'm just going to drop in some steps and show the type of things which we need to achieve here, and then I'll just talk through them one by one. And so these are those steps. Let's walk through them one by one. So first off, I want to JSON encode the data to have it in the same format which you will be in if you were sending a post request with some JSON data to this application. But the way we've done it, just to make life easy for ourselves in our tests, is we've just allowed it to be an array, and that will make it a lot easier than trying to write correct JSON strings. For the stuff that we're currently doing, we're only doing GET requests, so we're not actually using this or sending any data, but it's something which we could possibly do in the future, so let's make sure that we're doing it correctly. So we want to take that data and JSON encode it. Next, what we want to do is merge our server variables with the headers. So if you think about when we go to create a request object, normally you'll use the super globals for that, and one of those super globals will be the server super global. And so we want to make sure that we've got everything in the correct order there to pass into our request object when we create it. And that's going to be one of the biggest main differences between actually doing this as part of a test and when you're actually firing real requests at the application. We're going to create our request based on information which we generate as part of the test and which we can pass into this JSON method, whereas in real life you'd have a front controller and there you'd sort of create your request using the super globals as they exist when the request is received. Okay, and then the next step, so we're moving into the heart of our application then really, and so we need to get hold of a kernel object, and so we can actually create it by sort of instantiating it like we're doing here by just saying create new kernel, but eventually we're actually going to use a container for this. So we need to think about how we're going to do that. Are we initially going to have this sort of easy street version where we just instantiate it, or should we just go straight to dependency injection and get that out of the way? So that's another consideration. You have all these kind of considerations when you're doing a test-driven approach, because you've got to find the balance between getting the right architecture and actually driving things out with the test. So there are some points where you'll sort of think, well, do I need to drive this out with the test, or do I actually know what my architecture should look like? And so that's one of the considerations we're going to have with the kernel, I think. Okay, and so next, once we do have a kernel, this bit should be easy. What we want to do is call a handle method on that kernel, passing in the request which we created here, and then that handle method should return us a response. So the bit that we're looking at here should come back fully formed with the correct body, correct status code, headers, etc. by the time we reach this point. Okay, so those are the steps, but you're probably thinking, well, what order do we do these in? And normally I'd sort of do this kind of thing in reverse order, so working from the outside inwards. So I might probably create a kernel and then fake returning a response from there. But I think what I'm going to do is actually just do these in sequential order and then not actually get to this point where we're returning a response until we are fully able to do that. So we'll always have this bit sat underneath, but we can figure these parts out, for example the request, using unit tests so that we know when we actually really need that dependency it's already going to be working for us. Before we proceed, we're going to need some kind of request object, and that request object will contain important information such as the request method, the URI, and other server variables and things like that which we can use and which will help us form that response. At the moment we don't have that, so we need a way to create this, and we need a special way of creating this in our tests where we can actually pass it some information sort of manually without it having to rely on superglobals. And so for that we're going to create a named constructor which will be used mainly in our tests but will also be available to be used anywhere else throughout the code where needs be. Okay, and so we'll have a look at how we'll create that, and then these parts here you'll see how those feed into the creation of that request object as dependencies. We shall proceed like this, so I'm going to say request equals request, and then we're going to have a static create method on there. So create, and then we'll use this to figure out what is the bare minimum information we need in order to create this request. And so we've already got some clues. We're definitely going to need the method, and we already have one of those, and also URI. Next we want the server variables, so if you think of the server superglobal, that's the kind of information we're looking for here, and we're going to create some of this ourselves because we've said that this JSON method is going to be used to sort of fake requests to our API, so we'll set some headers on there to say that we are dealing with JSON. Okay, so we don't yet have a server variable, but we're just going to fill that in. And then the last one will be content. So we're not actually posting any content for the example we're working on at the moment. We're just making a GET request. But if you want to make post requests, put requests, things like that, then you're going to need some content. But we said that the way that we're doing this is we're taking this data and we're going to encode that. And so basically that's what we are doing here. So we'll say content equals JSON encode, and then we pass that data. Next we want our server variables, and like I said, we're also going to do a little bit of manual work just so that we know that our application is dealing with JSON. So here I'm going to say server equals, and we'll do an array merge. I'm going to add these here, so we're saying the content type is application JSON and to accept application JSON. Okay, and then we are merging that with the actual headers. So we could set some headers when we're writing our tests, and so we'll just pass that in there, and there we have enough information to go and create a simple request object. Now obviously this request class doesn't exist yet, so let's go and do that next. Now when we worked on the response class, we already were using some methods on that response object, but we're not actually doing that with the request class here. So I'm not actually going to write a test for this. I'm just going to go and add this functionality for creating it. And maybe later when the request does a little bit more, then we'll do some tests for this. A TDD purist might not agree with that approach, but I think for this, that should be okay. Okay, so our request should live in the same place as our response, which is in the HTTP folder. So I'm going to create a new class. This will be called request. The namespace will be app HTTP. And then we just need a public static function that will be called create string method string URI. We'll say iterable, and this will be our server variables, and then string, and that will be our content. And all we're going to do from here is just return a new self. And then we just need to go back to our API test case and make sure that we are importing the right request. So that's from app HTTP. If I run my test now, nothing should change. Everything should still pass the same because we are just creating this request, but we've not changed any functionality whatsoever. So let's go and try and prove that theory. Vendor bin pest tests. Okay, 2 tests and 2 passes, no failures. Okay, so at the end of the last one, I said that we were going to do the request test when we actually add more functionality to our request, but I've had a bit of a change of heart. I think we'll get this boxed off now because the only real methods that I foresee adding to the request at the moment are the ones which we are going to need for routing, which is going to come up shortly. And so things like getting the request method, getting query parameters, and getting the path. So I think we'll go and write a test so that we can obtain those things, and then we know that that work's done, and then we have our request dependency completely boxed off. So this will be inside of tests, inside of unit, in the same place where we created our response test. We're now going to create a request test. So remember, this is a PHP file, not a PHP class. So request test. Okay, and then what are we testing? We shall say it creates a correctly formed get request object. Because obviously for post request, delete request, things are going to look slightly different. We'll have data with them, and we'll also have different request methods. So this request object which we are testing here, which we are creating here, is specifically for get requests. Okay, so there's going to be two steps. The first one will be creating the request, and then we'll make some assertions to make sure it's being created correctly and that we can actually call those methods which I mentioned off of it. Let's remind ourselves of our request. So this is it. We're going to use this static create method. So we need method, URI, any server variables, and any content. So we won't actually need any content here. Request equals request. That's one from app http create. Let's drop onto another line. So the method here will be get. The URI, let's just make something up. So I'm just saying some path, but you'll notice I've also put some query parameters into there so that we can check against those, and then we'll know that we're able to use those also. Then server variables, so let's use the ones which we also used in our API test case. So we're setting a content type and an accept key, and then like I say, we don't actually need any content, and so that should be our request correctly created. Now let's create some expectations. So we'll say expect, request, and the three methods we're going to look at here are get query parameters, get path, and get method. And this is in keeping with the PSR7 API. So here we have the request interface, or server request interface as it's called here, and on there is a get query params. If we also look for get method, as you can see we also have one of those, and that is on request interface. And then we need get path. There's a slight difference with get path because what PSR recommends is using a URI object. So if we have a look here, if we scroll to the top, we have a URI interface. So they actually take the whole URI and encapsulate that in an object. But we're not doing that. We're just putting everything on the request class. But by sticking with the same methods, I think it would make it easier in the future if we decide to extract that and create our own URI object. But like I say, we're going to put it all on our request object. And so here we'll say request get query params, and we want to match an array. So we'll say to match array, which is one of the built-in expectations in Pest. And what we said here was black equals white and day equals night. So that rhymes. Black, day, night. And again, like I said before, we can chain these. So next, what we'll do is we'll say request get path. And we'll just look to do an exact match on that, and so we can say to be, and then the string that we're looking for, and that will be some path. And let's do another chain and request get method, and this is an easy one, to be get. Okay, perfect. So here in this first step, in this act step, we are creating our request, and then we're just making some expectations to make sure that that request has been created correctly, really. And we're just checking that we can get the query params, get the path, and get the method. Let's go and run our unit tests. So I'm running all of the tests in the unit folder. And so one fails and one passes. The one which passes is our response test, which we already know we've created and that works. And then we're on to the request test. And so here, Pest will just tell us what we need to do next really. Call to undefined method app HTTP request get query params. So what we need to do in the next one is go over to our request class and create that method and make sure that it's working correctly. This is where we left off, call to undefined method app HTTP request get query params. Okay, so let's just take this step by step and we'll go and add a get query params method to our request. So public function get query, if I can spell it right, query params, and this should return an array. Okay, let's run the tests again. And we should see a different error. App HTTP request get query params return value must be of type array none returned. Okay, let's return an empty array. Sounds tedious, but sometimes when my brain ain't totally firing, I just let the test tell me what to do, and then suddenly I'll spark into life and figure things out from there. Failed asserting that an array has the key black. Okay, so if we go back and look at our test, we're expected to see these query parameters, and so that's what we need to figure out how to put into there. So for the time being, let's just fake this until we make it, and I'll drop the correct details in there. Okay, and so it seems happy with that, and it's saying call to undefined method app HTTP request get path. So we've got past the stage where our query params isn't working. And so what we need to do now is actually take this and refactor this. And so where do these come from? They actually come from our URI. So we need to somehow grab these details from our URI and put them into an array. Okay, so I actually know a way in which we can do this. If we go up to our create method here at the top, then what we shall say is URI parts equals parse URL, and then into that we pass the URI. I'm suddenly feeling the need to dump things out, and I'd like a nice way of displaying it when I do that. So before I go any further, I'm actually going to get Symfony var dumper as a dev dependency. So I'm saying composer require --dev, and it's Symfony var dumper. var -dumper. Okay, and so here I'm just going to actually dump that out and see what my URI parts looks like. Okay, run the tests again, and you'll see that when we parse that URL, we get two parts here. We get the path and we get the query params. Okay, and I'd like this part to be in array format, and so there's another built-in PHP function which I can use for this. Parse string, parse str. Let's go and see what this does. Okay, parses the string into variables. If the second parameter arr is present, variables are stored in this variable as array elements instead. Okay, so for the first argument, we're going to pass URI parts, and we are looking for query. We'll make sure if that doesn't actually contain anything, then we'll just set it to an empty string. But then by passing it a second argument which is passed by reference, then those query parameters should be stored in this variable. Let's dump this out again and make sure that I'm not just making that up. Okay, run the test again. As you can see, we now get our query parameters in this nicely formatted array in the exact format that we want it in for our test to pass, which is good. Okay, so here, let's drop onto a new line. And before we actually go any further, we haven't actually defined how this should be constructed. So we need to do that first. Okay, so we'll just add these as and when we need them. For the time being, we're just taking care of our query parameters. So query params, and we'll make sure that this is an array query params. And so these are basically the values which you would normally get from the get superglobal. Okay, so let's go and add those here. And then what we need to do is return this query params, And our test should be at the same stage. We should now be getting to that next stage after the query params failure, which we were getting previously. Let's run this. So we get one failure, and indeed we are. Call to undefined method get path. Okay, so it seems that our test is happy with what we've done to satisfy this part, and we are now onto this get path, and we need to make sure that our path looks like this. This is our next error message, so call to undefined method request get path. Let's go and fix that. So in our request, just going to create a public function get path, and then this should return a string, so we'll put that part in. But apart from that, we'll not actually do anything. All we'll do is just run the tests again. So vendor bin pest tests unit, we're just running our unit tests at the moment. Let's see what happens now. Request get path return value must be of type string, non-return. So we're not actually returning something from there. So let's figure out what we want to return. If we actually go back to the request test, let's just fake this for the time being. So we're expecting get path to return this some path. So that should be easy enough to fake. We'll just paste that in there, and then if we go and run it now, we should be on to the next failure. And indeed we are. So call to undefined method request get method. So we need to go back to this and figure out how do we get to this point. We need to refactor this and use the real thing. What I'd really like to be able to do is to get it off of the request URI. So that should be something which lives on the server variables. We don't actually have that yet, and we're looking for a key called request URI. And so what this string token function does, or what it will do for us here, is it'll look at that URI. If you remember the way that we've got it set up here, we're actually adding some query parameters. So it should split it here and just give us back this part, which will be correct. So like I say, server vars, we don't have that yet, so let's go and add that to our constructor. I'm just going to initialize this as an empty array, and then here I'm going to set the request URI on our server superglobal. So request URI equals URI, and then we need to pass server variables here. So we'll say I'm going to do an array merge. This, the server variables which we can create in our test, and also what we have here. So anything in that second array, if it has the same key, should overwrite what's in the first one. Okay, I'm getting a squiggly underline here because we set this as an iterable, which means it won't work for array merge. So let's not try and be clever, and we'll go back and actually make that an array. Okay, so we're setting the request URI on the server superglobal using the URI which gets passed in to the create method, and then we're just merging the server variables which get passed in to the create method with the actual server superglobals. Hope that makes sense. So that means we've got one last step here, and that is just to pass server variables to the constructor. So hopefully now if we run the tests, we should still be at that same stage. Okay, so call to undefined method request get method, which means that we've actually got past this part, and that should be correct. So like we've done before, let's just put a semicolon there, and we'll comment out the rest of the test, and hopefully this should leave us a green. Okay, 2 tests and 2 have passed. Let's go back and uncomment that and remove the semicolon. And now we can move on to the final part, which is we just want to make sure that we can retrieve the method. This should be a nice easy one. Okay, so lastly, in order for this test to pass completely, we need a get method on our request. So I think what I'll do on this one is I'm going to pause and let you have a go at this if you think you're up to it. I'll give you a slight hint, and that is to say that the way that we did this server request URI, what we want is a request method key on that server superglobal, and then you should be able to have a look at this and really take it from there and figure out what you need to do. So if you do want to have a go at this, then pause me now and give it a go. Okay, so I'm going to sort of work backwards and do what we've done previously just to stay consistent, and just do the method first, even though I could quite easily go straight to the solution, I think. So this needs to return a string, and we'll go and run the tests. Okay, so I get a failing test. Request get method, return value must be of type string, none returned. So let's just return what is the correct answer. So get all uppercase, run this again. So we're now getting passing tests. How do we replace this? Well, we want to do a similar thing to what we did here, where we are getting the request method off of the server variables. So I'm going to copy that and drop that down to there. I'm going to change this to request method. Okay, and then I'm going to run the tests again. Obviously that fails. I'm not returning anything because that hasn't been set yet. So just up here where we said server request URI, what we'll do is we'll do a very similar thing. That's it, we'll say request method equals, and then you can see that we're actually passing the method into this create static method. And so that means that that should now be set, because we're setting the request method on the server superglobal. The server superglobal gets merged into this server vars variable, and then that is getting passed to the constructor. And so now we should see a passing test. Let's go and test that theory. Okay, 2 tests, 2 passes. Like I said previously, the methods that we've tested there are the ones we're likely to use. These are maybe the only variables that we're likely to actually use on this request object, but of course it would have others, because you've got to think of all the other superglobals that you would have when a request is sent. So what we're going to do is we're going to just go up to the constructor. I'm going to just put a comment in here. So this is to represent the server superglobal, and then the other properties will be these. So we have post parameters, so if you like posting a form, you have cookies, and also files, so uploaded files. But like I say, for our purposes, we're not actually going to use these. I've just added them in there for completeness. So I think that is our request in the condition that we'd like it to be in, and that we need it to be in to complete the rest of our feature test. Let's just go back to our API test case. Okay, so we now have a request. We know that that is being created correctly, and it'll have the right methods that we need in order to handle routing and stuff like that. So we can now move on and think about having a kernel. Okay then, one more video to round off this section. Before we go any further, let's run all of the tests to see where we're up to. Okay, and so we've got 3 tests: Books API test, request test and response test, and we're getting passes in all of those, so that's good. As you remember, the request which we created, we're not actually using that anywhere yet. We've just created unit tests for that. So let's start to bring it a bit more into play. So what we need to do now is create the kernel, which the kernel acts as the heart of your application. It gives you a chance to encapsulate your entire application almost inside an object, which is there's loads of benefits to it, and you'll see them as we go on. Okay, so first we need a kernel. Let's just go and write the code that we wish we had. So we don't have a kernel just yet, but it says we need to create or resolve the kernel. By resolve, that means resolve it from the container, which we'll get to eventually, but for now we're just going to instantiate things. Let's just get on to the next section. Okay, so now what we want to do is this: response equals kernel handle request. Basically, we are passing our request into a handle method on the kernel, and within that handle method, then everything should take place in order to form a correct response for that request. Hope that makes sense. And then here, we're just going to return that response. So return response, and then these parts We can just comment them out. I'm just going to comment them because we're still going to need them in a moment. Let's just go and run the tests again, and we should see fails now. Okay, so we have one failed and one passed. So our unit tests for request test and response test, obviously they're still going to pass, or maybe not so obviously, but our Books API test, we now have a problem in that class test kernel is not found. So we don't actually have a kernel class. Let's go and create one. So this is part of our HTTP really, so this can live in the same folder as our request and our response. So inside of there, PHP class, kernel, make sure you got the right namespace, app HTTP, and initially all we want on this is just a handle method. Okay, so public function handle, we know that this will take a request, app HTTP request, and we know we want it to return a app HTTP response. So we've done one step ahead there really, but let's just go and run our tests again. Okay, so we're still getting a failure. Class test kernel not found. That's because we have not imported the kernel. So app HTTP, make sure you're importing the kernel at the top there. Run the tests again. So we're still getting a failure. App HTTP kernel handle return value must be of type response non-returned. So we haven't actually returned anything, and so remember when I commented this out and said we're still going to need it. Let's fake this. So we'll go over to our kernel, drop that in there, uncomment that, make sure that we've got the right response. That is correct. So I think here we should see a pass. And indeed we do. So we're back to 3 passing tests, and in addition to having 3 passing tests, we now have a kernel class. Okay, so there we've covered the first couple of sections of the course. Obviously the course is a lot longer than this. There's going to be a lot more stuff to cover. If you want to watch the rest of the course, then you can go and find details at garyclarke.tech. I'll leave a link in the description and also on the end of the video. I'll see you there.